My name is Tetsudo Tanaka. I was born here in West Los Angeles, just a few blocks east of Santa Monica, in 1939. And then when I was 2.5, Pearl Harbor happened. And therefore, because of the US government executive order signed by FDR, president at that time, all Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans like me, born here, had to relocate away from the coast because of concerns about being further attacked by the Japanese.
Were you born in your parents' house?
No, I was born at that time in downtown Los Angeles. There was a Japanese hospital.
Ah.
Because all the mothers had no English.
Uh-huh.
And the doctors that they used could speak Japanese.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that was necessary, as would be of maybe an immigrant from someplace else in another country in Europe or elsewhere where they had just come and never had a chance to study English in their home country. My mother and father were born and raised in Japan until young adults, and my father was born in a prefecture in western Japan called Shimane, and it's next door to Hiroshima, another western prefecture where my mother was born. And they got married here, and then I was born here.
And what was your father's name?
My father's name was Tetsuji, spelled Tetsuji.
And your mother?
Her name was Yoshie, Yoshie Tsukada, Tsukada. That was her maiden name. So they both left Japan in separate pathways, which I'll explain a little bit later. But just to mark the calendar, my dad was born in 1886, more than 130 years ago. And just a few years after Japan opened up their country, after 2 years of isolation and voluntary closure. And then my mother was born in the year 1905, the year of the Japanese-Russian War. I had no brothers or sisters, only child to my father and my mother. But there's another separate chapter of each of their lives. Before I was born, they had a prior spouse. And in each separate case, they lost their spouse. And my mother had 2 daughters. So I have 2 half-sisters.
Ah. Was that here or was that in Japan?
Here. All here. So I'll talk about that subchapter. My father was married, and his wife, unfortunately, at a young age, probably around the age of 25 or 28, I estimate, died giving stillbirth to her 3rd child. And the first 2 stillborn children are buried in a cemetery in Huntington Beach in 1921 and 1922. So I estimate that my father's 3rd stillborn child and wife passed away around 1923, 1924. My mother came here as a bride, got married in Hiroshima. She and her husband came here 1921. And my mom got married in October of 1921 when she was 16. And then she spent November packing clothes for herself and her husband to leave Japan permanently. And they spent December on a 4-week boat ride from Hiroshima to Los Angeles. Because in those days, it was only coming by ship. And so then she began having children. She had a daughter in 1923 and 1924.
So your mother was a teenager when she had her first two children.
Yes, and that was normal in Japan. At age 16 or 17, 18 at the latest, you started having children.
Okay.
Yeah. Both my mother and father came from families that had 10 to 12 children. I once asked my father why he left Japan, and he said, you had to be there to understand that my brothers and sisters and I, almost every meal, we only could eat about half a meal. That was all the food that was available. And the country was in a very depressed economic state, especially in the West. And so when you look at history of where the Japanese originally came from around the 1880s to 1920s, they came from 4 prefectures, and those were the hardest hit. And that included Hiroshima and Shimane.
Do you know what year your father came and your mother came?
Yes, my father came in 1905 at the age of 19, the year my mother was born.
Uh-huh.
And so my mother came here in 1921 at the age of 16 when she was married. Immediately had two daughters. My father was already here. I think he was getting married. He came by himself first as a bachelor. And then after maybe 15 years, he sent back for a arranged marriage, then brought his wife here also to West Los Angeles Hotel. And that's when they tried 3 times to have children, and she passed away with a third one around 1930-ish, I think, or 1925. Yeah.
So, I mean, understood that they were fleeing deprivation. Mm. Why did they choose Los Angeles?
Because of prior immigration out of Japan.
There was already an established
and immigration out of Hawaii, territory of Hawaii, the sugar plantations. The Japanese first just went west looking for a new world and a new economic life, better life. And going west to them, they went to Hawaiian plantations because they were in need of laborers. But as I read the history, they were virtually turned into slaves working 7 days a week in Hawaii at very low pay. And then they began asking and finding out that there was another place called California. And there was much good soil and good weather, and the beginning of growing vegetables and fruits and some flowers. And my dad remembers in the old days, he said Marina del Rey was all lima bean fields. And so there was a lot of simply farm labor work available at better conditions in Hawaii. Mm-hmm. And so Southern California developed a reputation in Japan for being a very fertile place in terms of finding work, and where there was a demand for laborers. And it's the kind of work that one could do without English. As the Japanese population began increasing from 3,000 or 4,000 immigrants in one year to 20,000 coming in the year 1920, and many of them became picture brides coming in. There grew an understandable concern by the U.S. government to say, we need to have some laws. America is for Americans. It's not for immigrants to take our land. And so I think somewhere around the 1920s, there was a law enacted where specifically Japanese could not own real estate. And it was broadened to say all aliens could not own real estate. And there was no naturalized citizenship. So one way that immigrants from anywhere outside of the U.S., from anywhere in the world, could own land was have children. And even if they're 1 year old, they were born here, they're a citizen. So buy the land in the name of the children. I've often said, accurately, that in my home, I felt like I was in Japan. And it was entirely Japanese culture. Language, nonverbal communications, before the meal, putting your hands together and reciting a prayer to thank for the meal that we're about to have in Japanese. But outside the home, it was America. And even so, with other Japanese American kids, I'm sure that was all in English. And then once you got to kindergarten and first grade, of course, that was an American public school. And so that was really of interest to my parents, because they always loved America, and having made the decision to come here, they never had a single moment of thought ever going back. And the large majority of Japanese immigrants all felt that way. This land here in the 20s, 30s was so fertile. There was, just so many opportunities, and it was a growth area. Los Angeles was just still a small little town and a young town. So there's just a lot of opportunity. Everyone was looking for things to do, businesses and a life to make. But they found it difficult when they came around 1920, 1930s to rent a house as they would have liked closer to downtown Los Angeles, like Crenshaw Boulevard or someplace like that, or Glendale. They were not. The landlord would not rent to minorities that looked and talked and acted so strangely different. Mm-hmm. And so the reason this area of West Los Angeles, Sawtelle, became so prominent to the Japanese as a second or third most prominent Japanese area in Southern California was that, this side of Beverly Hills, or now the I-405 freeway, Sepulveda Boulevard, was all open English walnut orchards. There were no buildings, and those walnut orchards were very old. And so someone would build a house and rent it to the Japanese, because there was no other neighbors here to protest that. Uh-huh. And so that's how, a minority developed a minority neighborhood, probably not so different than old cities in the East Coast of the United States back in the 1800s or 1700s.
You were 3 years old, or 2.5, you said, when
Pearl Harbor happened.
When Pearl Harbor happened, and the Executive Order 9066 and the removal happened in...
The order was signed February 1942. And so that meant the Japanese Americans had about 2 weeks to vacate. But the government, of course, didn't have any place to put all the Japanese and Japanese Americans that were to be interned or imprisoned further inland. So it took the WRA, the government set up War Relocation Authority. And that was the agency created by the federal government, War Relocation Authority, WRA, to manage the overall incarceration and internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans. And so quickly, the government had to find a place and build living quarters, residential quarters, for what turned out to be nearly 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans. 70% of the 120,000, 70%, so that's around 80,000 85,000, were Japanese Americans born here like me. And today we call that racial profiling. Yeah. And so for those of us living in Santa Monica, Mar Vista, Venice, and West Los Angeles, any Japanese Americans were rounded up because of that executive order and ordered in April to assemble at the Japanese Institute of Sawtelle at 2110 Corinth Avenue, just one block from here.
Uh-huh.
And it's still there, with still the same frontage and same house numbers. And so we were ordered that each person could take one suitcase maximum that you could carry. If you couldn't carry it, you couldn't take it. And Manzanar became, for our area here, the place that we were all destined to, and that's where 10,000 of us ultimately filled that camp up in 36 blocks. Each block had 14 barracks, and of the 14 barracks, there were a total of, I think, about 10 home units, each the size 20 feet by 25 feet. And up to 8 people were put into one unit. Camp Manzanar, located between Lone Pine and Independence on Highway 395, became the largest city between Los Angeles and Reno in 6 months with 10,000 people. And so it took them not only building the barracks, but they had to build a sewage treatment facility, electrical power, and they had to bring in plumbing and water supply, and because no one knew how long we were going to be there. Yeah. It turned out to be, with the atomic bomb over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, August, it turned out to be 3.5 years in that internment camp. It's understandable that the U.S. government had this agency that we know as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. And the FBI took it upon themselves as their responsibility to look out for the safety of the country. And as Hitler and the Nazis expanded, naturally the FBI and the U.S. government became very concerned about German immigrants, and were they friendly and safe, or were they pro-Nazi? And then as Mussolini came to power in Italy, same thing happened about the Italians that were coming to the East Coast. And then, late during World War II, Japan, Germany, Italy formed the three-power axis.
Tripartite Act.
Yes,
Pact.
and by then Japan was, had invaded Korea, Mongolia, Manchuria, China, Indochina, parts of Southeast Asia, and South Pacific Islands, and they were expanding. Yeah. So naturally, there was a concern, and part of the job of the FBI was to be doing some advanced intelligence gathering. So what the FBI determined was that any Japanese immigrant or Japanese American who was a minister of the Buddhist religion or the Shinto religion, the two main religions of Japan, or who taught the language, who taught karate or judo, or who were an influential business leader in the local Japanese business communities, even in business communities in places north of Santa Barbara in Lompoc. There were business leaders who were grandparents of my friends, my childhood friends, and they were rounded up before the executive order. And they were immediately, because they were called high risk, they weren't allowed to stay at home. So when Pearl Harbor happened, within 12 hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, there were already nearly 100 Japanese put into La Tuna Canyon Detention Center. And so once Pearl Harbor happened, the Japanese, there were hundreds, nearly more than 1,000, 2,000, within 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. They were rounded up. They were just pulled right out of their home, right out of their bed, not told why they were being taken, no warrant, no explanation, and just pulled out away from their wife and their children, and just told to get your shoes and your coat on. You're coming with us in handcuffs. And they got sent over to a detention center. And there were about 40 detention centers in places throughout the western half of the United States where these higher profile Japanese Americans were put. And speaking of Tuna Canyon Detention Center, the Japanese Americans have made a historical book, and in this small book of that, remembering that era, there's a name of all 2,000 people, including German names, Italian names, and Japanese names. Their names are all in that book, just in Tuna Canyon, 14 miles from City Hall, Los Angeles. I was age 3 to 6 during those 3.5 years at Camp Manzanar. Easily my best memory and strongest memory and clearest memory as a child, basically before school, was I had a used tricycle. And in between Barracks 2 and Barracks 1, in the center, the parents had planted some vegetables, but in the perimeter around the vegetable was a walking path. And that became my tricycle track. And I would spend 6, 7 hours just riding that track. And to me, that was my life. At evacuation, if the parents had a vehicle, if they had bought a house in a children's name, they had to just leave to go to camp. They were being imprisoned. So, and businesses, if you had a grocery store or a gas station or auto repair or an orchard or a nursery, you were going to jail. Yeah. And so the non-Japanese waited until evacuation day and paid 10 cents on the dollar.
And took over these properties?
We were gone. We were in prison.
There were a few instances I've heard of neighbors looking after properties, but by and large...
There were many who promised to look after
didn't.
And said, we don't know when they're going to be coming back, or if, and even if it is 5 years from now, maybe they're going to go to the East Coast. Who knows?
So now, you started kindergarten in the camp.
Yes.
And that was a regular school year?
I don't remember exactly. I think so. I do remember vaguely being in one playroom, some kids on tricycles, and we all had, various toys. I felt most for high school students because in 1942 they were told to report for the beginning of school in September. And there were no chairs, there were no desks, there were no supplies. In fact, one of my friends, Rose Honda, said she reported to class, 10th grade, and she looked up and she said, Mrs. Hayes, what are you doing here? And she remembered Mrs. Hayes from Emerson Junior High School, right here by the Mormon temple. And apparently, she had signed up to work as a faculty at the school at Camp Manzanar. No, Caucasian. And so all the teachers were Caucasians, and then they must have had faculty barracks and dining hall and shower facilities somewhere in the dusty camp. So they were really pioneering in a way, but without supplies yet, because you'd just gotten in there in months.
So you were 6 when you got to come back to Los Angeles.
Yes, fall of 1945. I do remember the ride back because my father, a month or two before, had gotten permission to come to Los Angeles on his own with others, I'm sure, other fathers, to buy a used car. So he bought a 1934 Dodge and drove it back to Camp Manzanar. It was a coupe. So it only is a stick shift. Big long stick shift was right in the middle of the floor, so it really could hold 2 adults. And so me, as a little 6-year-old, small at that time, I laid most of the time on the back shelf under the rear window and napped or just rode there. But it was a dusty, long, 10-hour, tiring ride. And when we finally arrived at night, I didn't know where we were. I just wasn't thinking anything. I was so tired. I was just going to follow my parents and do whatever they said. And I found ourselves walking into the back of a house and upstairs down a hallway. And I distinctly remember, for the first time in my life, I smelled perfume. Can you imagine coming out of an army barracks and walking upstairs into an 8-bedroom house a block from the Beverly Hills Hotel? Talk about from black to white. But the Johnson family had apparently gotten to know and trusted my mother. She must have been a domestic housekeeper there before the war. Ah. And so the Johnsons told my mother, you know, whenever it is, when the war ends, and if you need a place to land, you know, we've got a lot of extra bedrooms here. So you're perfectly welcome to come here and land here with your husband and your son. And so that's what we did for the first year. I walked with one of the Johnson sons, was in 2nd grade, so he showed me how to walk 6 blocks to school. After 1 year, my father found an apartment, a small apartment above a garage where we could have more of our own privacy. And that was, again, 1 block east of the Beverly Hills Hotel. And again, I walked to elementary school, 2nd grade and 3rd grade, 3 blocks. We were just north of Sunset Boulevard. And one of my fondest memories was at 8 a.m., I would walk from the apartment above the garage to the front and get ready to go down 3 blocks to school. And directly across the street, often I would see, and I got to know what a Cadillac Coupe de Ville looked like, because the owner across the street had this brand new Coupe de Ville, wore a hat, and had a long cigar, his window rolled down, and he was going to work. And it was Edward G. Robinson, the mobster actor who was famous in the 30s and 40s.
Wow.
Yeah. To this day, I lived under the same roof with my parents from birth to age 25 when I got married. And I never, ever heard them say a cross word about being incarcerated, or the internment camp, or the United States, or ever heard them shed a tear. They kept everything inside to themselves. There was a well-known Japanese word that expresses what I just described. It's called gaman, gaman, G-A-M-M-A-N, gaman. And gaman is almost like slang. All children grow up knowing it. It means bear with it, or be patient, or have patience, persevere for the future, and bear with it. When you watch sports events and the Olympics on television, if there's a Japanese athlete, you'll hear the Japanese crowd all yelling, gaman. They're telling the athlete, you know, do your best, hang in there, you know, try, persevere. My father had, while we were 3 years in Beverly Hills right after the war, he was saving his money to buy a lot and build a new house, because he knew from before Pearl Harbor, the homes in West Los Angeles that were available were very cheaply built and were low quality. And so in those days, he was able, in 1948, he was able to buy a deep single residence lot and build a brand new two-story, two-bedroom house with two double-car garage for $12,000 total. So that became my base where I could walk to Norris Dairy, grades 4 through 6, and then junior high school, I went to Palms Junior High School, where there were no Japanese, because I was just in the boundary south of Olympic Boulevard, and I couldn't go to Emerson Junior High School, where most of the Japanese American kids went to. And so there is a worthwhile story for me in my history of being at Palms Junior High School, because there was about 1,600 students there, grades 7, 8, and 9. And there were only 5 Japanese in that school. So I knew 2 of them. And, but that didn't faze me much, because I was only 1 out of 28 in a class in 3rd grade, in 2nd grade and 1st grade. And the fond memory I have is that by the time I was in the 9th grade, I had made myself enough friends where I was voted boys vice president of the Boys League. And at that time, I just thought, well, it's kind of, if you can do it, you know, do it. And, you know, you have these friends and they'll vote for you. And they'll help make posters for you because it was election time. And that's all I thought about it. But looking back at it now as an adult, I could see that what I was really honing was social skills of being friends and making friends, right? Then from there, I went back to General West Los Angeles University High School, public high school. And that is located near Santa Monica Boulevard and Westgate Avenue near Bundy. Again, just a few blocks east of Santa Monica, the city limits. And in 1954 to 57, when I was there, we had students in one high school, a large high school, University High School. We had students from north of Sunset Boulevard, from the Pacific Ocean, Pacific Palisades, Brentwood, Bel Air, Westwood. And then from south of Sunset Boulevard, there were the Mexican-American and Japanese-American kids from the flatlands here down to Olympic Boulevard, Pico Boulevard. And we were all in one school. And so it was a very positive experience of having friendly on-campus social environment and study environment with students. Yet I was very comfortable because there was a pocket of us Japanese Americans, and we all had lunch in the same part of the patio every day, Monday through Friday, and the Mexican Americans had their own area near the athletic field.
Did you speak Japanese with your Japanese American fellow students? Or?
No, we spoke English. But every day, Monday through Friday, from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock, we went to Japanese language school, which is on this street again, the same place where we had to assemble to go to Camp Manzanar in 42. It still exists today.
Japanese language school.
Yeah. It's nearly 95 years old. But you know, we were born, and the only place we know is America.
You mentioned your father had saved money over those first years you were
Yes.
back and bought the house and built the house.
Mm-hmm.
What was he doing for work?
He was a Beverly Hills gardener. Apparently from around 1930, I suspect, to 1942. And then from 1945, he picked up the same business again until he retired around 1970. So most of his adult life, the first maybe 15 years, he was a ranch hand picking vegetables and fruits on a farm. But an interesting point is in 1942, when we were given only 2 weeks to drop everything, cars, furniture, washing machines, television, and just go to camp, one of my dad's customers, which to me, it's rather humorous. It's the first house on the same Rexford Drive as the Hawthorne School and the Beverly Hills City Hall and Beverly Hills Police Headquarters. First house north of there, Dr. Bumpus, medical doctor, had a house, and he had a huge basement, like an Eastern house. And he offered to hold all of my father's gardening equipment for the duration.
And did he?
Yeah, he did. Yeah. So I think the kind of work experience and exposure my mother had with the Johnson family before Pearl Harbor, and my father with Dr. Bumpus and probably 15 residential gardening customers in Beverly Hills, they knew they would be accepted back, that these were educated people. Some of them were of Italian or German background. They themselves worried that they might be put on a list. And so I think that's why they thought, well, we're not going to be still yelled at and called Japs and told to go back to Japan like you would if you moved back to Boyle Heights or moved back to Venice where you came from, because the white people in those areas would certainly do that to you. Okay, you got released from camp, but you killed hundreds of thousands of American GIs. We hate you. Go home. And so I was spared all of that. In fact, I had a very positive life. Mm-hmm. And to this day, later in my career, living in a school environment from 8 to 3 o'clock with entirely Caucasian children, and then gave me an outlook in my adult life quite different than my other friends who were Japanese Americans who came back to an entirely Japanese neighborhood and were criticized and could only go to certain stores or gas stations that would allow a strange-looking Japanese to buy gas there or buy groceries there.
Did people your age talk freely about that experience when?
No. And I think we simply got that from our parents. That's a very important point. Gaman, that I explained earlier, the parents applied to themselves. They just said, we can't protest. We don't even speak English. We don't know what laws are. We don't know a congressman. We don't even know what congressman means. It's an English word. We don't have congressmen in Japan. And so I think the parents said the most fundamental things about this country being here, that there is work, you can earn a living if you work hard and you're reliable and you're steady, and you can earn a living, and you can have enough food to eat at night, and you can find a place to rent, and you can get out and buy a used car, and you can become a gardener if you work at it and do a decent job where they want you the next month. So they just put their head down and said one other term, which is appropriate, kodomo no tameni, which is Japanese. Kodomo means for the sake of our children. So their gaman, their perseverance, was fueled by their belief that if we persevere, inherently this country of the United States is a wonderful country fundamentally. And it'd be a great place for our children to thrive and have their life and build their generation. They inherently believe that. Never talked about Japan, the emperor, the Japanese national anthem, or going back to Japan, and things of that sort.
Your father put you to work. He had you work with him.
Summer vacations. I remember as a 10-year-old, we left home at 7 in the morning with a rice ball and maybe a fruit for lunch. And we worked until the sun went down at 6:30, 6 days a week.
So you joined him working these properties?
Right, for summer vacation, 3 months. And so I learned, boy, gardening is a messy, dirty job. You don't keep dry or clean. There wasn't much glamour to it. You got to take the trash to the rear alley where all the other trash and rotting things are. And you sweat a lot, and you get dusty and wet and damp and tired. And the one thing that taught me was, boy, whatever I do, I don't aspire to become a gardener. That came through clear and true. And I suspect that may have been my father's objective.
So as you finished, what year did you graduate high school?
57.
And did you have your sights set on a career or college?
No, because my parents couldn't read English or really converse with people who could speak English, and all their friends were immigrants who were lucky if they finished high school, and they were doing blue-collar manual labor here. So my parents never had a single sentence of conversation with me about career or what are you going to do with yourself. It was kind of like silence. So I quickly figured out that I was on my own. I was on my own. My parents never went to a single parent-teacher meeting.
All your years in school?
All my years in school, first grade through 12th, because they couldn't understand a teacher. Understandable. I went to California State University at Northridge, majored in business administration. In 1957, the U.S. Army had a special program for a limited time period where between the ages of 17 to 18 and a half, if you volunteered for U.S. Army basic training, 6 months, and volunteered for 8 years of Ready Reserve meetings instead of 6 years of Ready Reserve meetings, they would guarantee that you would not be drafted. And in those days of the late 50s, early 60s, that meant Vietnam. And so that was one way.
Vietnam was already on the radar.
Oh, yeah.
In the late 50s.
Oh, yeah. There was no other place. And because they were already drafting from the mid-50s, and they were all going to Vietnam, and a high percentage getting killed.
How did you and your wife meet?
That comes back to where we are, a temple that in 1926, my dad was a co-founder of this West Los Angeles Buddhist temple with 9 other friends. And so I was literally born into this West LA Buddhist temple and still am here. There was never any question whether I was going to stay in or out of this religion. No more than I was going to ever change my last name. I found it interesting that in this temple, for the younger people that were in high school, they had a young Buddhist association group of teenagers. And so it had a cabinet, it had meetings, it had activities, fundraising for the temple, or sometimes an outing to go skiing, or to have dances or parties at another temple. And they also had similar organizations. So I thought, That's pretty handy. I'm beginning to notice the other gender as a teenager, and finally getting my driver's license. And so, to answer finally your question, how I met my wife, through the Buddhist Churches of America, which this temple is a member of. At the college age, the Senior Young Buddhist Association had a very well-established organization at each of the temples, and there's about a dozen temples in Southern California. There's several in coastal San Jose, Watsonville. There's more in the Bay Area. There's more in the Sacramento area. There's more in the Fresno area, and then in this Phoenix and San Diego. And once a year, there would be a Western Young Buddhist League conference. And ultimately, I guess through my enjoy being with people and doing things with people, I became president of the Western Young Buddhist League in 1961. And along the way, obviously, as a single person in the early 20s, I was looking at a lot of young ladies, as they would do, I'm sure, from their viewpoint, looking at a lot of young men. And so at one of the conferences in Berkeley in 1960, I met my wife, and to this day, pretty near #1 best experience of my life, 55 years.
Let me just ask you this, because you mentioned this. Talk about going fishing off the Santa Monica Pier with your dad.
Oh, that was pretty minor. It was a wonderful experience. It was a precious, priceless, fun time. Fun time because basically it's always fun to go fishing to see if you're going to get a bite on and actually hook a fish. Mm-hmm. You know, that in itself is just so simple but rewarding. And there were tons of fish at Santa Monica Pier in around 1950. Mm-hmm. I was counting, remembering, we would catch about 6 different varieties of fish, all very edible fish. And we would have a pailful, sometimes 2 pailfuls, so much that we'd just give them to the cats when we got home.
Wow.
Yeah. And of all things, I remember we would use shrimp as bait. We had, and because my dad had some customers who had bamboo in their backyard, he would pick out a long, straight, 12-foot length bamboo, cut it and bring it home, tie a nylon string on the end of it, the length of the pole, and a hook on the end of it with a little BB weight. That was fishing gear.
Yeah.
And that was good enough to get the bait about 6 feet below the water and catch any one of 6 different fishes. Wow. Once in a great while, even a barracuda. Yeah, but we caught halibut and mackerel, Spanish mackerel, perches, sardines, smelt, herring, all edible, all wonderful. And we'd go there about 5 in the morning for about a couple of hours, and sure enough, we'd see some of the same friends that I would go to judo or Japanese language school with their fathers, because all the fathers, there was no English. And so this is something you could do without the language.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it'd be worth one observation as a concluding comment. At my ripe age as a senior citizen, it's finally sinking in that maybe a collection of the sacrifices that my parents went through. And I'm sure it was very common for the immigrant parents to themselves live by kodomo no tameni, which means we're doing this for the sake of our children having a better generation. I think I've just grown up with, fortunately, a life spared of being racially picked on by the majority white community and not being stereotyped. And So it's really enabled me to become friends with members of your history museum, archive people, which had led to this oral history, which I was not intending on. Mm-hmm. But I think it's become a very, very happy ending, very happy conclusion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.